For those who don't know me, I'm Sabine Schmidt, the permanent faculty at the School of Historical Studies representing Near Eastern Studies, and co-hosting today's event with me is Maria Mercedes Tuya, representing Digital Scholarship at the IIS, and Josh Kiras, Editor-in-Chief of Gorgias Press.
We're very glad that you could join us and hope that you're as excited as we are for having the opportunity to embark in a journey led by books and its owners. Different yet fascinating. I want to do a few housekeepings. Please use the chat function to send your comments or questions. They will be addressed at the end of the talk or after the talk, but please feel free to do so while the talk is in progress. Also, we appreciate if you do not use the raise hand function, as we would not be able to acknowledge those.
Welcome on behalf of Gorgias Press. I would like to thank Gemma, who organized the lineup for this season, culminating in the season finale now with Laura Hassan. We look forward to future seasons of The Author's Voice. And towards the end of the talk, Gemma will tell us a bit more about that.
So it's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Laura Hassan, the author of Asharism Encounters Avicennism, Sayf Al-Dīn Al-Āmidī, which is the topic of today's webinar. Laura Hassan is currently faculty associate at the Oriental Institute at the University of Oxford. There she teaches Islamic intellectual history, particularly theology and philosophy. Laura studied as an undergraduate at Oxford, spending a year of intensive Arabic study in Alexandria. As part of her degree, she also studied Syriac and aspects of Eastern Christianity. She later completed an MA, then PhD at SOAS, University of London, under the supervision of Dr. Ayman Jihadeh. Laura has a special interest in instances of intellectual encounter in Islamic history, whether between adherents of different theological schools, between the philosophical and theological traditions, or between Muslims and intellectuals of other religions. She has recently extended her interest in encounter to take in perspectives from the philosophy of religion, and she has written on issues in science and religion from the perspective of the Islamic heritage. And now, without further ado, I pass the floor to Laura.
Thank you very much. I will just share my screen. Can you see that okay? Excellent. Okay, so I would like to say, first of all, just how very delighted and honored I am to be here today. When I was writing the study, I often had this feeling that I was walking around in a kind of dim room where I knew that there were treasures to be found. And so to finally have it out there, to have the book out there, and on top of that, to know that there's people who are willing to hear me talk about it, to share some of those treasures is really wonderful for me, genuinely so. And I like to say especially thank you to Dr. Gemma Tully at Gorgias Press for all her planning and support, as well as, of course, to Dr. Kiras and Professor Schmidtka, who I'm so delighted to have hosting me today. And of course, what I want to do in this time is give an idea of how the book was conceived, the idea of it, and of course, my main findings. But I also want to view those findings today through the lens of the philosophy of religion. And the book itself is mostly a work of intellectual history. And for my method in that, I took the model of my excellent supervisor, who we've already mentioned, Dr. Ayman Jihadeh. But since I've written the book, many of the more philosophical implications of the findings of my book have dawned on me a lot more deeply. And I've become more interested in questions of perennial relevance, such as the notion of a good disagreement and what that might look like between different traditions. And so today I'm going to use that framework to consider my findings in a slightly different light. And unashamedly there, I'm arguing for the contemporary relevance of the record of Islamic intellectual history. So just to give you an overview of where we're going, I'll begin with that context. Then I'll introduce my use of this term paradigms that will feature throughout the talk. Then I'll finally report some of my findings about Al-Amidī himself and contrast that with the approach of his more famous peer who lived in the Islamic East and traveled around the Islamic East Fakhruddin al-Razi, who died in 1210, and then I'll conclude with my reflections. So firstly, the book's basic subject matter. So my book, and along with it many other recent studies, takes impetus from a significant development in the field of Islamic intellectual history that's occurred over the last couple of decades. And that's the realization, which is prompted in part by the work of scholars like Dimitri Gutas and Yahya Misha, that the philosophical production of the Islamic world, far from going into decline in the period after the great theologian and jurist and mystic Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, whose lovely picture is here. Far from this production somehow decreasing, actually, there was a huge surge in philosophical production. And this was often in the form of works of philosophical commentary on previous works. And actually, Professor Schmidtke's at the forefront of making the enormous number of manuscripts that reflect this tradition more widely known and more readily available. But this realization of the level of production in what we can call, for convenience, the post-classical Islamic world runs against this previous conception that was held among scholars of the generation of, say, Ignaz Goldziher, who died in 1921, which went that Al-Ghazali had so opposed the tradition of Hellenic philosophy that he'd effectively killed it off. It's now increasingly apparent that philosophy, theology, and theological philosophy all continue to be practiced, and actually that the cross-fertilizations between the traditions which had previously been rather separate and in a rather inimical relationship to one another, led to intellectual developments that really deserve a lot of further study. So that's the basic context of the study. And in the context of my particular book, oh, sorry, I skipped a slide. There's two traditions that are most relevant. And these are the tradition of Hellenic philosophy, called in Arabic falsafa. And this found a truly Islamic form, first of all, in the thought of Al-Farabi, who died in 951, but preeminently in the thought of Abu Ali ibn Sina, who's known in the West as Avicenna. So that gives you the first ism of my title. My Avicennism encounters Asharism. There's my first ism. And the second is Asharism. And this was by Ibn Sina's time the most prominent school of kalām. And this tradition of ilm al-kalām, often translated as dialectical theology, speculative theology, is what we're specifically talking about when I mention theology in this case. And then the individual in whose thought the meeting of these traditions is studied in my book is Sayf Al-Dīn Al-Āmidī, who died in 1233 and who was an extremely skilled jurisprudent, dialectician and theologian, who was also highly practiced in the tradition of falsafa. And this is where my interest really was sparked. I was interested in the various influences on his thought, not least because he was actually a very controversial individual. His life ended in house arrest. And the cause of his house arrest was taken by some, and actually only one of his contemporary biographers, but many of his later biographers, this myth was kind of perpetuated. It was taken that his interest in philosophy was the cause of his difficulties later in his life. And this meant that among Western scholars, he actually became this kind of paradigm of Goldziher's persecuted philosopher. But as Endres and Ventures have conclusively shown, it's very unlikely that Al-Amidī was persecuted for this reason. But in order for me to study the respective influences on his thought and to try and understand this controversy a little better, I took the very contentious issue of the creation of the world. And this is an issue which, of course, continues to provoke hugely heated discussion among and between religious people, and especially in our times, with and between scientists with an interest in cosmology. But in the period that I study, traditionally, although not without exception, the philosophers of the Islamic world had supported Aristotle's thesis of the eternity of the universe, while the rational theologians had really relied in establishing that God exists and that he is this particular kind of cause of the world with volition and with power. They'd relied on the thesis that the world came to be from nothing. But by the time of Al-Amidī, who I study, Avicennan philosophy was so widespread and also aspects of his own theology were so compelling for the theologians that they couldn't but engage with his beliefs about creation. So in the next section, I'm just going to explain how we can think about the doctrines of creation that come together in this period as ideas which don't stand alone. So they belong to intricate and entrenched paradigms. And another way of phrasing this is to use the term worldviews, which is quite popular among philosophers of religion. And what this means is that when a theologian of Al-Āmidī's time is developing a doctrine of creation, he was forced to consider how these disparate paradigms might be brought into conversation with one another. And ideally, I believe that such a conversation between paradigms should happen in a way that's epistemically productive, that creates new knowledge, and theologically fruitful, that creates theological creativity and innovation. And I'm using the term paradigms in a slightly sideways way, in a different way perhaps to how it's used normally. But I do use it to bring to mind Thomas Kuhn's great work on scientific revolutions. And he argued there that the arguments and theories of a scientific nature are never developed in isolation from these broader intellectual paradigms. And he describes this process of paradigm shift, where practitioners are exposed to anomalies, which very, very gradually cause them to question established community norms. And this is his definition of a paradigm. It's a universally recognizable scientific achievement that for a time provides models, problems, and solutions to a community of practitioners. Now, of course, Kuhn was writing in the context of science, where the data is of a very different kind and where knowledge is produced differently. But I think that this is also a very useful way of thinking about historical, theological, and philosophical traditions, which do provide these model problems and solutions, which are accepted among a particular community, and which importantly provide this kind of framework within which a set of questions about a given problem, in our case, the God-world relationship, are explored. And such a paradigm will have an influence right down to the level of the structure of a philosophical treatise, for example. It sets the expected ordering of topics, the kind of things that are to be discussed in each one. And so the paradigms in this case are Ibn Sina's Aristotelian, Neoplatonized notion of the God-world relationship on the one hand, and then on the other, the classical Ash'ari vision of the character of this cause of a world created ex nihilo. And as I argue in the book, these doctrines are embedded within a web of natural, philosophical, and metaphysical beliefs. And as such, the theologian who works at the boundary of the traditions has to take on this whole network if there's going to be any kind of meaningful exchange. So I'm going to introduce you to just one of Ibn Sina's arguments for the eternity of the world. And the main point of my discussion here is to show you how this argument exists within a paradigm. And many of Ibn Sina's arguments run along the same lines as those of his philosophical predecessors. And so let's just take one of them. So Ibn Sina maintains that the possibility that something will come into existence, say this leaf, the possibility that it will come to be is so real as to require a substrate in which to inhere. So if this leaf grows on a tree, prior to it, there was some existent possibility for leafness and for this leaf, and not the mere non-existence of the leaf. And the significance of this, of course, within the present context, is that if everything that comes into existence requires some preceding substrate, then nothing can come to be without something prior to it, which ultimately gives us an eternal world. But in order to establish this need for a substrate in which possibility inheres, Ibn Sina has to eliminate other ways of understanding what possibility is. And he does so in many places, but the argument that I'm taking here is from his Kitab al-Shifa. It appears both, that's one of his major philosophical summa, and it appears in both the physics and the metaphysics of that work. And it goes like this. Prior to every existence, as we said, there is this realized possibility for it. And Amar Muhassali is the term he uses, not just its non-existence in general. Possibility is a relation. It's intelligible in connection to something else. So we think of the possibility of a leaf, of a child, of the world. Relations, according to another principle of Ibn Sina's, cannot subsist in themselves. So this possibility can't be a self-inherent existence that simply exists in itself. Neither, though, is it simply equated with the power of an agent to bring something to be. And this is because it would result in a circular definition of possibility. So if we said that that whose existence is possible can be brought into existence, what we'd actually be saying is this that's here in the red, that which can be brought into existence can be brought into existence, which is obviously meaningless and which trivializes the power of the agent, because it implies that the agent can simply do what it can do, no more, no less. And Ibn Sina concludes that if possibility is neither a substance in its own right, nor the power of whatever brings the thing to be, it must require a substance in which to inhere, and through argumentation, he shows that this substance must be matter. Now, the argument itself is strongly akin to Aristotle's argument in Physics 1:7, that whatever comes into existence must do so from a pre-existing substrate. And I just want to show you how there are several theories which are strongly connected to this argument. So first we have a natural, I keep skipping slides. Here we go, a natural philosophical theory about the nature of physical bodies. So according to Ibn Sina, and in this he's generally developing an Aristotelian idea, body is constituted of an underlying substrate, which is self-inherent. And when I say that, I mean that it requires nothing further in which to inhere. And this is matter, hayl or mada in Arabic. When this is combined with form, with surah, corporeity is constituted. Matter then is not corporeity. Without form, there is no body. But matter provides this potential for body, form, its actualization. And that conception of physical body is clearly present in the argument that we've just seen, and that Ibn Sina is aiming at an argument that gives him a material substrate underlying the generation of all physical bodies. There is also a metaphysical idea of possibility that I've already referred to, and which I'm going to show is entirely alien to classical Ash'ari ideas about possibility. So Ibn Sina has this very strongly realist conception of possibility. Possibility isn't the multiple synchronic alternatives understanding that we commonly hold today, where a thing is possible insofar as we can conceive that it might occur. And that possibility is actually no more real than our ability to conceive of something. But Ibn Sina's idea of possibility is strongly connected to his physical theory of potency. In order for something to come into existence, there must be a specific material privation and associated potential. So, and these are beliefs which are proven in other parts of his work and discussed at length, but they're obviously connected to the proof at hand. So they're part of what I'm calling a paradigm. Therefore, if one is to effectively address the argument itself, then one at least has to engage with these related beliefs. If we leave Ibn Sina to one side for a moment, the second of Al-Amidī's most important influences in his discussion of creation is obviously this theory of his own theological tradition, that's Asharism. And again, my purpose here is to highlight the network of ideas related to one of their arguments for the creation of the world. So the Ash'aris, and indeed the Mu'tazila as well, the other major school of ilm al-kalām, typically argued for the creation of the world using the proof from accidents. And there are several premises to this proof. It relies upon the exhaustive division of the universe into two components, substance, jawhar, and accident, arad. And it's very important to define the term substance here, because clearly it's a term that's used by the philosophers to very different intent. And this is important because shared terminology can actually rather confuse the relationship between various beliefs and confuse the question of whether there is a genuine disagreement or not. For the Ash'aris and for the theologians, substance is matter, nothing more. And this matter is ultimately divisible into minimal parts beyond which no further division is possible. And we conveniently translate this as the atom, although with a particular understanding, of course. Accidents are the other constituent of the universe, and they provide matter with its characteristics, including its aggregation in particular bodies, in bundles of atoms which we see as bodies. But also these accidents give bodies their color, their scent, and also their quality of being in motion or being at rest. These accidents are also called by the theologians hawadith, and this is in reference to the fact that they are generated, they're always generated. And according to the Ashis, there are no existence in the created universe beyond these. And specifically, there are no immaterial self-inherent entities like the souls or the intellects of the philosophers' cosmology. The next important premise in the proof is that substance cannot exist without an inherent accident. And accidents, as we've said, are generated, they're not permanent, and there are proofs for this point in the theological Summa. And that which can't be devoid of something generated, the argument goes, cannot itself be ungenerated. And the Ashis explicitly realize that this relies upon the possibility of an infinite regress of temporally originated accidents inhering in an eternal substrate. So they argue against the possibility of an infinite series. And they go from here, which so far we've arrived at substances being generated and accidents being generated. They go from here to use their proof, their principle of particularization, to then affirm the existence of a particular kind of cause for the world, namely one which selected between alternatives in creating the universe. So a volitional and a powerful agent who can choose. If the world came to be, the argument goes, with its particular age, shape, dimensions, all selected from among possibilities, it must have a particularizing cause. And hopefully we can see an immediate contrast here between the context for the two theories. And there are particular beliefs which are completely opposed to one another. So body, we've seen for the theologians, isn't the composition of matter and form, but simply an aggregation of building blocks. Matter isn't a continuum, but individual parcels, so to speak. And this is important, that matter is basically stuff that comes to exist from nothing by the action of God to bring it into existence. Prior to the existence of matter, there simply was non-existence, not some kind of potential. And this relates to their idea of possibility, a metaphysical idea, which goes that possibility isn't present in matter. It's simply the presence of synchronic alternatives, synchronic conceptual alternatives, from which a choosing agent can select one to action. So obviously the doctrines of creation are incompatible. In the one model, you have a world produced by the essence of its cause and an eternal world. And in the other, a world deliberately chosen through the will of its cause. But underlying this kind of straightforward incompatibility, we have two webs of interrelated ideas. And I need to highlight at this point also Ibn Sina's most original contribution, because Ibn Sina worked hard to reconcile the philosophical belief in an eternal world with the Quranic notion of creation. And I believe that it was this that provided the anomaly, to borrow Thomas Kuhn's terminology, the anomaly that provoked a kind of paradigm shift among certain subsequent theologians, because it was what the theologians found most convincing about Ibn Sina's metaphysics that brought on their encounter with his system. So I've said that Ibn Sina views possibility in highly realist terms, and that much is Aristotelian. But Ibn Sina made his own distinction between essence and existence, which he then married to the distinction between necessity and possibility. And this was married to powerful metaphysical effects. So Ibn Sina held that in the case of all existence, which are not necessary, and the necessary existence turns out to be God alone, so everything else, in the case of all other existence, their essence is only possible in itself. And this is to say that although their essence determines what they would be, if they come to exist, should they happen to exist, their essence is actually indifferent to whether or not they do in fact exist. And such existence must have a cause if they're going to exist. They will not exist of their own essence. So Ibn Sina does something important here, because he places the contingency, the dependence of the world on a cause, in the very nature of the essences of which it's comprised. And this contrasts with the view of the classical theologians, for whom an existent is contingent if and only if it came to exist in time. So its temporality, its coming to be, having not been, is what determines the fact that it needs a cause. But Ibn Sina's view also contrasts with that of Aristotle, for whom, although the world has God as its final cause, the end towards which it moves, God isn't the cause of the existence of that eternal world. He's not its efficient cause, to use the philosophical terminology, but rather each cause in the infinite chain of causes that regresses eternally is the efficient cause of the subsequent effect. And the reason that this is so significant is that it means that Ibn Sina could legitimately describe even an eternal world as caused in respect to its existence. And furthermore, he also went on to say that this kind of creation, this kind of causation, was the truest and most superior kind of creation. And he used all the Quranic terminology to qualify the kind of creation that he was describing. And I think if we take a step back and think about why all this is significant, why is the encounter between these points of view important? Well, paradigms we know can actually happily exist in isolation from one another. And they do so globally, although theoretically, at least in our world today, this is less and less the case. And there are two factors that I think make the encounter of paradigms particularly pressing. So first is that they coexist in the same environment. And secondly, that they have some kind of shared motivations, or at least interests, theoretical interests. So Avicennan philosophy not only coexisted with kalām, with this theological tradition, but it was quickly gaining momentum at the level of popular interest. So that to know Avicennan philosophy well was a form of intellectual and social currency. And this was certainly the case for Al-AMIDī. So I argue that his motivation in composing one of his works of philosophy in particular, كشف التمويهات في شرح الإشارات, seems to have been primarily the desire to maintain the patronage that he was receiving in a very competitive courtly environment of Ayyub in Syria. But also Ibn Sina does the most to fuse aspects of his own legacy and context. So his is without a doubt the most Islamic falsafa of its time. As I've said, it appeals to a Quranic worldview. It uses all the terminology and ascribes God the characteristics traditionally ascribed to him of power and volition and creation, although these terms are used with very different meanings. And I think that this was the reason that the Muslim world's theologians had to confront the paradigm. So, and also they have this shared motivation to best explain God's transcendence, as well as his interaction with the world in a philosophically satisfying way. That was certainly a motivation for the theologians, but also a way that was in line with the vision of the Quran. So finally, I come on to Al-AMIDī. What did the theologians do with this? And I'm going to briefly explain some of what Al-AMIDī did. And Al-AMIDī's close and sustained encounter with Avicennan philosophy is evidenced in particular in 4 of his extant works. And the first of these is An-Nur al-Bahir fil Hikam al-Zawahir. And this was written by the year 592, which is when Al-AMIDī left Cairo for Syria on one of his many significant intellectual journeys. And in this work, which is published as a facsimile, he actually endorses an Avicennan metaphysics and theology, and this includes the doctrine of the eternity of the world. He does refute aspects of Avicennan philosophy. So, for example, he argues that possibility is not an affirmative reality. It's not an amr muhassal, as Ibn Sina claimed. However, he has other ways of supporting the Avicennan doctrine. So this isn't then a mere summary or imitation of Avicennan philosophy. To me, it seems to reflect a genuine support for philosophical beliefs and also a critical engagement with Ibn Sina. Another important work is Rumuz al-Kunuz, and here's an image of one of the nice pages of the manuscript. And this is an abridged version of, or an abridgment apparently, it seems, of a work called Daqā'iq al-Haqā'iq, which is there's only 1 volume extant of that, unfortunately. But this was written in Damascus or Hama, again, by the year 1213, 610, so a little later. And this work testifies to a new stage in Al-AMIDī's thought. And he makes some really interesting comments in the introduction to this work, as well as in the Daqā'iq. And in particular, he says that he's explicitly concerned with the widespread influence of Ibn Sina. and with what he calls the awesome sounding expressions of the philosophers, and how they've distracted some people's attention from the revealed scientists, which after all, he says, are what truly leads to eternal happiness and salvation. And we might even dare to speculate that he's speaking of his younger self here as having been distracted in this way. But that is just speculation. But he sets out in this work to say which aspects of Avicennan philosophy can be tolerated by the theologians without compromising core creedal beliefs. And he claims that he's distinguished between truth and falsehood in the thought of the philosophers, but he insists carefully that this endeavor to him is additional to, he says, the revealed sciences upon which he relies. And among the beliefs of the philosophers that one can tolerate are such natural philosophical tenets as the indivisibility, as the infinite divisibility of matter, so hylomorphism, the theory that I've already referred to. But his tolerance of the philosophers doesn't extend in this work to the doctrine of the eternity of the world. So he maintains that belief and argues for it. But basically the subject matter of the work is falsafa and not kalām. But the general attitude in this work, which I would characterize as defensive and also pragmatic, I think actually comes to typify his approach to the meeting of the paradigms. And even though his works of kalām, which are a little later, are different, I would say that they're characterized by the same approach. And this is a manuscript of image of Afkar fi Usul al-Din, which is published in a nice edition. And this was completed only 2 years after the Rumuz, but it's a work of kalām. And here he explicitly styles the philosophers as intellectual opponents. He consistently opposes their beliefs on questions like the divisibility of matter, the existence of immaterial substances like souls and intellects, and on many other questions. The philosophers in this work are really just one group among a range of opponents of sound orthodox doctrine. And Al-Amidī presents in this work as a very skilled and thorough dialectician. Most of the work is devoted to the careful, systematic, and incredibly comprehensive refutation of alternatives to what he considers sound belief. He defends all of the creedal dogmas of Asherism. This includes, of course, creation ex nihilo, the entitative attributes of God, the theory of causality known as occasionalism, and the physical theory of atomism. And yet he has been deeply influenced by Ibn Sina, and I'm just going to give you a few examples of this. So he actually adopts Ibn Sina's basic ontological distinction, although of course he doesn't say that he's taken this from Ibn Sina, but in proving the existence of a cause for the world, he infers the existence of such a cause not on the basis of the world's creation ex nihilo, as generations of Asheris had done before him, but on the basis that possible existence require a cause to exist, even if they should regress infinitely, and that such a cause must itself be necessary of existence. And he also ultimately suspends judgment over the question of matter's indivisibility. And this is, although he introduces this section in which he discusses this, Ithbat al-Jawhar al-Fard, which means establishing or proving the existence of the atom, his ultimate admission is that he cannot prove this doctrine beyond doubt. However, he doesn't attempt an alternative theory, nor does he endorse the philosophical point of view. He just suspends judgment. And he also advises students to endeavor to kind of solve this problem. He also, and this is even more problematic, expresses an inability to prove beyond doubt that immaterial substances do not exist. And this is significant because despite the way in which he proves the existence of God, he still uses the proof from accidents to establish the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. And we've seen that this proof from accidents relies on the exhaustive division of the universe into the categories of material atom and their inherent accidents. So to admit that one cannot disprove that there are other existence in the cosmos is quite a problem if one wants to use the proof from accidents. And we know that this is a problem because he has a later work of kalām, and there he quietly abandons the proof from accidents and actually avoids discussion of physical theoretical matters and finds other ways to prove creation and to defend the Ash'ari creed. So to kind of conclude on the approach that he takes, he maintains the theoretical paradigms of kalām, and in many cases, although not all, this includes the ordering of topics to be discussed. So he does make some departures from the structure of a classical kalām manual, but only in a very limited way. In general, he follows the topics to be discussed. And this, to my mind, means that he fails to meaningfully compare the thought systems. And the result is that we have this maintenance of established creed, but also certain areas of theoretical incoherence. And this is one of the ways in which Ibn Taymiyyah, who died a century later, criticizes Al-Āmidī. And of course, this very brief summary doesn't do justice to the richness of Al-Āmidī's discussion. So hopefully you'll be inspired to either read my book or perhaps the sources themselves if you can, to see if I've made a fair case for him. But I like to compare him with Al-Razi by way of contrast. And Al-Razi actually develops a response to Ibn Sina, which involves sustained systematic comparison between the respective ontologies of Avicennism and Asherism. And the ultimate outcome of this procedure is a position that he reaches at the end of his life, a position of epistemic humility. And there's so many people conducting research on Al-Āmidī at present, so I'm only going to give the briefest indication of his approach here. But I've said that it's characterized by systematicity, and actually by a departure from the, by that time, rather confining model of theological manuals that had been maintained among the classical Ash'aris, which, although it was fit for purpose at the time, isn't working in terms of bringing these paradigms together and meeting the new challenges of Avicennan philosophy. And this allows him to fairly compare the different ontological premises of the arguments he treats. So, for example, in both of his philosophically orientated Kitab al-Mabahith al-Mashriqiyya, sorry for the strange macrons here, and also in a later, more experimental work, Kitab al-Muhassal, rather than simply following Ibn Sina in this primary ontological distinction between necessary and possible, or on the other hand, simply following the theologians in their primary division of eternal versus temporal, he discusses both distinctions, and he describes them as primary divisions of existence according to certain different considerations. He's also very careful to distinguish between disagreements between traditions which are merely terminological, such as disagreement over the word fa'il, agent. And this term was used by the theologians to describe a cause characterized by choice as well as by power, but used by Ibn Sina simply to define his true efficient cause. And he says that this is a merely terminological disagreement in the end. But on the other hand, there are substantial real disagreements, such as the question, in this case, of whether the world's cause is possessed of choice. That's the real disagreement. So he carefully identifies the real sites of disagreement. And the fruits of this in his discussion of creation are many. And I published an article last year that gives more attention to this theme than I was able to in the book, and particularly study his discussions in Al-Matalib Al-Aliyah, which was, as I said, was written at the end of his life and represents really the culmination of his discussions in previous works. And there he examines scripture and comes to this conclusion that it doesn't demand that the world was created ex nihilo, that scripture doesn't explicitly state this. And this is actually contrary to the kind of implicit assumption of generations of theologians before him. And I think this is quite a significant admission for a theologian of his heritage. And we could speculate that this is brought on by his exposure to Ibn Sina's alternative account of what Quranic creation might be. And it's also, of course, a mark of his intellectual independence. But then he goes on to evaluate whether or not the world is in fact eternal. So he sets out the remit of scripture in this and then comes on to the rational argument. And he's actually very explicit here that he agrees, and this is the case in the majority of his works, that he agrees with Ibn Sina over the nature of the relationship between possible existence and their causes. He agrees that possible existence rely on their causes, not because they're originated from non-existence, but because in their very essences, they're only possible. So possibility, he agrees, is the determinant of the need for a cause, not origination from nothing. And he's also explicit in agreeing with Ibn Sina on the fact that every possible existent requires an efficient cause if it's going to come into existence at all. And this is the principle of tarjih, for those who are familiar with the terminology. But this is very problematic actually for the theologians. And this is because it implies that if there's a change which causes the world to come into existence, say God willing that it comes into existence at that point, or alternatively, the connection, ta'alluq, of God's eternal will with its temporal object and the origination of the world, then that change itself must have a cause ad infinitum. And this is a real problem for the theologians, and Al-Razi is very honest about the problems this causes for proponents of creation ex nihilo. And in this case, the philosophical view doesn't suffer from the same charge, because if we have an eternally existent world emanated directly from the essence of its cause, without delay, we don't require a further cause. This doesn't lead Al-Razi to concede that the world is eternal. And this is because there are problems also with the philosophical point of view. For instance, Al-Razi is deeply unconvinced, like Al-Ghazali and actually like Al-Amidī too, with Ibn Sina's explanation for how multiplicity enters into the world after its emanation from a completely simple existence. So there are many problems with this. And Wahid Amin and Dawlat and Dadi Khuda both written papers on that very subject recently. I cannot, for reasons of time, go into my arguments for why according to my reading, Al-Razi absolutely ultimately does affirm belief in a created world. But that is my argument. And the reason that, well, as I said, I can't go into details, but he affirms this thesis as a theory that is most probably true, and in which one's belief is therefore justified. This is quite different from the approach of previous Ash'aris. His epistemic humility here, his acknowledgement that there are very strong arguments on both sides of the debate, doesn't allow him to affirm that his knowledge of creation ex nihilo is an absolute. He hasn't reached the level of yaqeen, of certainty, but this doesn't mean that one cannot hold a belief in the most probable position. And I think it's nearly time to conclude. So I want to briefly speak to a question of perennial importance really for the philosophy of religion by reflecting on this case from Islamic intellectual history. And the question at hand concerns the intellectual possibilities that occur during instances of encounter between traditions, which are the outcomes that are available for theists of a given tradition who find their worldview in this inevitable encounter with an alternative. And this is especially pressing, as I've said, where the alternative encountered is both broadly popular and compelling philosophically, but also in some respects threatening to establish creedal positions, as we've seen it was the case for Ibn Sina's philosophy. And perhaps in our context, we can think about modern science and its narratives about our origins as a similar kind of case of encounter. We've seen that theologians can meaningfully and honestly engage with the findings of their intellectual peers, but that this actually may involve risk. So Al-Razi, without a doubt, has lost much of the surety of his Ash'ari predecessors in his own assertions of conviction in creation ex nihilo. But he's also shown great theological creativity. So this encounter offers this opportunity for creativity. He's absorbed the most compelling aspects of Ibn Sina's metaphysics. And this has actually given him a model for divine transcendence, which he finds more compelling than the conviction that God is transcendent supremely because of his eternal existence before that of the world. And his creativity has also caused him to devise new proofs for creation that don't rely, for example, as the proof from accidents did, on this exhaustive division of existence in the universe into atom and accident, and actually proofs that are far more robust in the face of this alternative. And another example from his thought is that he admits that the impossibility of establishing either the existence of the atom or the infinite divisibility of matter. And this also leads him to innovative natural philosophical positions. And Bilal Ibrahim has written about this at length. And in that case as well, epistemic humility hasn't actually produced a decrease in knowledge, but an increase in creativity and in understanding of many of the assumptions which underlie creedal beliefs and which can be credibly challenged. And there may also be some resonance here with the thought of the Christian theologian Alvin Plantinga, who recognizes that belief in our particular God isn't a matter of pure reason. And I don't want to say here that Razi doesn't reason his way to his convictions. He certainly does. But he's also conscious of the limitations of pure reason and of the place of the innate human disposition, the fitra, which seems in his matalib to have the role of elevating these theories, which are already deemed the most probable through reason, to the status of justified beliefs. And on the other hand, we've seen Al-Amidī, who skillfully preserves the creeds of Ash'arism, but because he doesn't work in isolation from the prevalent philosophical beliefs of his time, has also very clearly been influenced by these beliefs in certain key ways. And in his Abqar al-Afkar, which is in large part a defensive work, we witness some of these inevitable tensions that have arisen from this attempt to retain the methods of classical Ash'arism in spite of that influence. The same questions are more settled in his later work in Khayat al-Maram, but this essentially defensive and apologetic attitude prevails. And it's probably clear which approach I personally prefer, but I leave it to my audience to evaluate whether I've made a fair case for Al-Amidī, who I have to say, in loyalty to him as my PhD subject and in admiration for him as a great thinker, he was an amazingly astute dialectician, skilled in each of these disciplines that he practiced in a way that we can only ever hope to be. So that's where I'd like to leave it. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Laura, for this fascinating and exciting presentation. And I think many of us will really want to read the book to see more of your analysis and also learn more about Al-Amidī. So we have a couple of questions, and please, for the audience, if you have, please type your questions and comments into the chat. We will go through them as much as we have time. So I start, there is a comment by Sheikh Shah, which is it's actually a quotation, but I read it nonetheless. So existence does not need existence to become existence, in the same way as whiteness has existence. And this is a quotation from Islamic philosophy from its origins to the present on page 70. I think that's Nasser's book, I'm not quite sure. Okay, then we have a question from Michael Mutreich. How can Al-Amidī support the idea of the eternity of the world but reject the reality of possibility? I think Avicenna thought that both the necessary and the possible are really real only. The necessary is the cause of the possible. It is not prior in time, though, but in, let's say, dignity. And thanks for the interesting lecture. I think there was a breach in the argument. Did you understand what he wants to ask?
I mean, there's a couple of thoughts here. I'm not sure that I think there is something missing from the latter. But he picks up on this important idea of priority and the different senses in which one uses the term priority. And this is the interesting thing about Ibn Sina, that he uses terms like before, and he uses the term hudus, but he qualifies them totally differently. So God is prior to the world, not in time, but in the nature of his very essence, ontologically. And so those ideas are very important in how he defends the eternity of the world by a creative, as caused by a creative agent. How can Al-Amidī support the idea of the eternity of the world but reject the reality of possibility? I think what actually happens in An-Nur al-Bahr, and I couldn't obviously go into this in depth, is that Al-Amidī isolates the discussion of potency from the discussion of possibility. And so he actually endorses in that work Ibn Sina's idea of potency. It's a little bit confusing because even in that work, he has the approach of a dialectician. So he takes doctrines and considers responses to them, and it defends certain positions, attacks others, considers attacks on Avicenna from others, like al-Baghdadi, and deals with that. So there's not always a good connection between the different ideas in that work. So he does, in terms of physical theory, he endorses the theory of holomorphism and presents arguments for it on Ibn Sina's behalf. But then when it comes to these proofs for possibility, And this is possibly under a Ghazalian influence. He rejects this idea that possibility is ithbati, to use Ibn Sina's terminology. He says it's adami, it's an idafa, it's a relation and a non-existent rather than a real thing. So I think, again, even in that very early work, you see part of the problem brought on by being influenced by the two paradigms, but not fully articulating the relationship between the different ideas. So being like, oh yes, of course, possibility, we know possibility is conceptual alternatives, but not really seeing that in Ibn Sina, this connection is absolute between potency and possibility. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. And there's another question from Hassan Riza Khani. Doesn't the reduction argument that the assumption that God has a will and the ability to make choice lead to an infinite regress analogously apply to the assumption that human beings have free will? Have you seen philosophers, theologians point this out in the sources?
Yeah, this is an excellent point, and it leads Ar-Razi. Ayman Shahade wrote his book on the teleological ethics of Fakhruddin Ar-Razi, and he points out that by the time of the Matalib al-Aliya, Ar-Razi no longer believes that humans have free will. And this is partly because of this principle of tarajjuh, that every effect must have a cause. And Ibn Sina himself, I mean, there are certain scholars who've defended the presence of free will in Avicennan philosophy, but I just don't see it as tenable. It's a highly deterministic schema. Caterina Bello wrote a book about this, and there isn't any room for human volition, certainly within that, well, for genuine free will, the genuine choice to determine what we do and why.
Thank you. To the attention of everyone, Gemma just placed a link so you can read also about all the research that Laura Hassan has done, and also order the book with saving 40%. So the link is here in the chat. Then Abdullah Galadari has a comment. Thank you so much, Laura, for a great presentation, and congratulations on the book. I look forward to reading it. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
And Mahmoud Serapishe, fascinating lecture. Thank you. Then Michael Mutreich continues the discussion of before. The world as a whole is real and is eternal, so possibility has to have reality since it is caused.
Yeah, I hope we've settled that through this distinction between how, you know, well, through the fact that Al-Amidī doesn't seem to draw together the threads between possibility and potency. But I mean, this is a very important part of how Al-Ghazali and Ar-Razi, of how Al-Ghazali in particular argues against Ibn Sina that possibility is merely what we can conceive of and nothing more. So to make it the basis of an eternal world is for Al-Ghazali meaningless.
Okay, and then Said Sabah has a comment. We need a copy of the lecture, please. So I just mentioned to everyone, we are, as you can see, we are recording, and all the lectures in this series, The Author's Voice, are being posted later on. I mean, once they're edited and approved, online, both on Gorgias Press site, I think, and then our site, but they will be available. Another question from Sher Shah. How much influence does Al-Ghazali had on Al-Amidī, and does occasionalism entail determinism? So 2 questions.
Yeah, thank you. So Al-Ghazali is an important influence. So one thing that I'd love to have talked about more is just how much Al-Amidī is responding to Fakhruddin Ar-Razi. I mean, this is why he's important in my book. It wasn't just a comparison from nowhere. Al-Amidī consistently responds to Fakhruddin Ar-Razi. He calls him mutafalsafat al-Islam, which is kind of the philosophizer, or the, there must be a better translation for that. But he's an intellectual opponent, and actually they were in competition for patronage. So Ar-Razi is the predominant influence and significant intellectual opponent, certainly for Al-Amidī. And actually in his later works of kalām, he's responding often not to Ibn Sina, but to Ar-Razi's readings of Ibn Sina. And this is fascinating. Page in, page out, he's aware of Ar-Razi's arguments and opposes them and comes up with these alternatives. In terms of Al-Ghazali, in Nur al-Bahir, so his earliest work, he mentions Sahib al-Tahafut, so that's obviously Al-Ghazali. And he often cites arguments by Al-Ghazali. So for example, when he speaks about and defends the doctrine of the world's eternity, he does so against Al-Ghazali. Many of the arguments are straight from the Tahafut, the arguments used against Ibn Sina that Al-Amidī cites in the Nur, and then he attempts to give defenses of Ibn Sina against Al-Ghazali's critique. So Al-Ghazali seems to be more important at that early stage, but later on, it's all about Al-Razi. And sorry, there was a second question about occasionalism and determinism. It's not strictly related to the topic of my book, but certainly, but yeah, I don't think I need to address that one now. I don't think I can address it separately, maybe.
Yeah, thank you. I would like just to jump in with another question. My own, as I'm not reading it. I mean, in the broader worldview of or scholarly framework of what you're studying, I mean, you say you have two big paradigms. One is of Avicennism and the other one is Asharism. What I'm asking myself, I mean, where do you place Mu'tazilism? Because many of the things that you say, well, this is from Ghazali or this is from Razi, I mean, like notions like idafa, ta'alluq, tarjih. I mean, this is all coming from the late phase of Mu'tazilism. I mean, especially Abu Hussein al-Basri and Ibn al-Malahimi. And I mean, especially if you read Fakhruddin Razi, I mean, he's essentially taking the theology of or the theological doctrines, works of Abu Hussein al-Basri, translating them into an Asharite picture. But many of the notions he's using are actually coming from Mu'tazilism, and much of even at earlier times when we look at the development of Asharism, also Juwayni, I mean, he's also, I mean, the first one who really integrates philosophical notions. I mean, it comes through the adoption and reading of Mu'tazili works. So where does this figure as a paradigm, or why don't you not include it?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And you know, in some ways, it's the way you set up a study leads you to, I admit, it leads you to a particular way of viewing the problem and a lens through which to view it. And certainly Al-Amidī is constantly responding to the Mu'tazila as well. So he sees them as, you know, I mean, the philosophers are in his Afkar al-Afkar, they're just one group of opponents. The Mu'tazila are the other significant opponents. And what's very interesting is that you get sometimes a conflation of Avicennan and Mu'tazili beliefs. So for example, the notion of what a thing is and whether you can have a non-existent thing. This is conflated with Ibn Sina's notion of essences for obvious reasons. And they become these joint opponents of the Ash'ari belief. So yes, I perhaps could have looked further at the Mu'tazili, the significance of the Mu'tazili background to that. But yeah, he is constantly responding to Mu'tazili creed and the differences between the Ash'ari and the Mu'tazila. Yeah.
Then we have another question from Hassan Rizakhani. If the philosopher do not endorse human free will, why are they so silent about typical difficulties, concerns that are raised by rejecting human free will? Or did some of them address these difficulties? For example, one such difficulty would be that at first glance, the discipline of ethics appears to lose significance when one assumes that humans have no free will.
Well, Ibn Sina has his own understanding of meta-ethics and of moral ontology and of a notion of providence. So for Ibn Sina, there's this order of the good, and everything ultimately strives towards that. And ethics is actually a very practical aspect of how society can be organized in such a way that it gives people the opportunity to fulfill their potential as humans, which is to know the universals and to know the true essences of all things, which is ultimately what unites us with God, because he is pure intellect. So yeah, there is a separate ethical framework, a separate explanation of why ethics are important. But I mean, for me, the free will problem is a problem in Ibn Sina, and it's, you know, but it's inevitable, because if you see the world's cause as this necessitator, then that's where it leads you. Nothing remains anything other than necessitated.
Yeah. Another question from Kubra Sumeye Bahti. E.G. and Giorgiani, following him in his sharh, are saying that Amidī had a special view about the connection between two issues. The theory of God as a free agent requires creation from ex nihilo, or that necessarily emanating God requires the eternity of the world. But in contrary, Amidī sees that the eternity of the world is compatible with the theory of God as a free agent.
Yeah.
What are you thinking about this view of E.G. and Giorgiani? Does Amidī stand for this view?
It's an excellent question, and I treat this theme in the book because it does seem that from the time of Al-Aidī, people begin to stereotype the view of Al-Amidī, and very interestingly, they contrast it with the view of Al-Razi. So Al-Razi very clearly, from the beginning of his life to the end, says that if you have a volitional agent who can genuinely choose, it gets you a created world. And that's all the later commentators know that he said that and cite him as saying that. So Al-Amidī, and there's a good reason that they say that Al-Amidī argued on the contrary, that you can have a volitional agent who produced an eternal world. And there's two reasons for this. One is that, as I said, so he begins by arguing for the existence of a cause for the world from the principle of possible essences, rather than from the principle of temporality. But then he goes on to make this very interesting dialectical argument that ultimately says that such a cause must produce a world created ex nihilo. Sorry, I'm trying to cover it all in one. It's a bit difficult to do. What I want to say is that Al-Amidī actually doesn't really stand for this position, but that in a dialectical situation where he's dealing with Al-Razi's view, at one point, and I only found one place where he says this, he says that in theory, this eternal world could be possible, even if we have a God possessed of volition. And I think I have to refer you to my book because it's a little bit complicated to explain, but it doesn't represent his overall belief, but it's something that the later commentators pick up on and say, well, only Al-Amidī ever said this. Nobody else has ever said this. But yeah, I can't put it succinctly here, so please have a look at the book.
Thank you. We have another comment for everyone from Maria in the chat, where she gives the website, the URL, where you can find any of the videos, the previous ones, as well as this one will be there once it is approved. Maybe I have a completely different question about Al-Amidī, and I don't know very much about him, and it's not philosophical. I mean, especially when you compare him with Razi. I mean, how do we have to imagine the transmission and reception of his works? I mean, I mean, again, compared with Razi, where we have a lot evidence for wide reception. I mean, the works you mentioned, I mean, how many manuscripts do we have? In which circles were they read? And very much related, I mean, to what extent can you establish, or can we establish, or has been established, the chronology of his writings? And are we certain about the authenticity of each one of them? Because they seem to be very different in character.
Yeah, and in particular, this has been an issue with the Nur al-Bahar, not relating to authenticity, but relating to dating. Because there's a passage in the beginning of the book where he talks about how, you know, he's had this hard life and he's coming to the end of it, and he hasn't had enough time and enough help to write his philosophical, to write down his thoughts. He hasn't had enough patronage. And some scholars take this as evidence that it's a later work, but the work is dated. And so to me, this is just rhetorical. So I'm clear on that chronology, but it is subject to some dispute whether that, and in fact this becomes very important because some scholars have seen the Nur and other works like it as these kind of summaries of philosophical doctrine, not implying any commitment. So it is important how you date these works as to the significance you place on them and whether they're seen as, you know, whether we can say that Al-Amidī underwent a change in his convictions, or whether he was just experimenting with the different genres. Okay, and in terms of how many manuscripts, I mean, Kashf al-Tamwihat fi Sharh al-Isharat, which is a commentary on Razi's commentary on Ibn Sina, is only known in 2 manuscript traditions, and so it's not, it wasn't widely read and widely known. And to me, this kind of reflects the situation of patronage and the great popularity of Razi. It was, you know, that was a kind of commentarial dead end. There wasn't much comment on it beyond that point. And this, surely this just tells of the towering kind of prominence and popularity of Razi as opposed to Al-Amidī. But his works of kalām and of jurisprudence were much better copied. There are many manuscripts of the Abkar. And this seems to be strongly linked to his influence as a jurisprudence, the same kind of method and approach he takes, and he's predominantly known for those works. So, but yeah, I'd be very interested in your thoughts on this. You're the manuscript experts, and on the kind of questions that one should ask as well.
Thank you. There's another question from Kubra Sumaya Bahchi. Question about the modal philosophy of the Ash'ari philosophers. Regarding the power, qudra, of God, the Ash'aris are thinking that God's power only relates to the possible. So the principle says God can only create what is possible. Does this require an existential wujudi possibility? But then this does not fit to the view that modalities are only concepts, i'tibarat, of the ratio. How does Amidī understand the principle above?
I'm not sure why the principle that God can create only what is possible requires some wujudi possibility. I don't think it does for the Ash'aris. So therefore, it's hard to answer the question, because I agree with the notion that the modalities were only concepts for them. And then Al-Amidī agrees with this ultimately. This is how he can see as a possibility, because he doesn't believe in essences. Things are either existence or non-existence, full stop. So you don't need anything more than a conceptual understanding of what possibility is. And we understand whether or not something is possibility in relation to previous existence rather than in relation to essences.
Okay, thank you.
Sabina, I have a quick question, if I can.
Yes.
Thank you, Laura. This is really excellent. I have a question. Do you know if anybody looked into a comparison between the notions of creation in Islamic thought and the Syriac genre of the Hexameron in Greek, and in Syriac, الأيام الستة شتوت يومي, whether there are any intersections between these cultures?
I actually don't know the answer to that, I'm afraid. Very, very interesting question. And I don't know the answer, unfortunately. But something that might interest you is that Razi, when he's speaking of scripture and its basis, he also talks about the Torah and the Bible as, he says the same. He assesses the biblical scriptural imperatives for creation as well. But I'm afraid I don't know about those intersections. But it's certainly, I don't think they were happening at this point in Islamic intellectual history.
Thank you.
I think we are coming to the end of our discussion. I mean, Kubra Sumaya Bahchi continues the discussion. I read the last one, but then I would suggest that you and him connect directly if there are issues. So he writes, so there has been to be something possible before God created it, so that we can say that God only creates what is possible. I don't know, probably I have a problem in my mind. Thanks a lot. Great work. Great work.
No, these things are very confusing. And we can certainly talk about this separately. But
yes,
if you think about the principle that something is possible if we've seen it exist before, then you don't have to have a possibility first. You just have an existent first and a series of existence, and then you know what's possible.
Okay. Yes, and none of us, at least the audience and me, have read your book, so I think we will all learn much more about him once we learn the book, and I'm sure you will be happy to answer any questions by anyone after they read the book, who have questions to you. So I'm passing now the word to George and Gemma.
Thank you so much, Laura. Again, this is really fascinating, and it's the perfect end for the season. Gemma now will tell us a bit more about our plans for the next season.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you to Laura for that fascinating lecture. I think of all the lectures this year, Laura's one has certainly made my brain hurt the most, and that is got to be worth winning a prize for. So yeah, just to say, we've got a program coming up for 2022, which we will announce. And the idea of the Author's Voice series is to bring together from across the disciplines of the humanities and to bring the joint interests of Gorgias Press and the IAS together. So there'll be Islamic studies, Jewish studies, biblical studies, Eastern Christianity, linguistics, all of these possible things to come in the next series. So keep your eyes peeled. And I just wanted to say a quick thank you, firstly to the IAS for agreeing to partner with Gorgias Press on this project. It's been a really fantastic first year. To Maria Mercedes Tuya for all of the digital support. And then of course to Sabine Schmichter, George Kires and Angelos Haniotis, who have been our hosts, and to our other authors who of course have also provided extremely stimulating lectures. So earlier on in the year we had Eli Wardini, Solange Ashby and Michael Bonner. So thank you to everyone. Keep your eyes peeled for the new program, and we look forward to some fascinating discussions next year.
George, you want to have the final word, or?
Well, thank you, Gemma, for organizing this. And again, thanks to everybody, and also to our listeners who are the drivers of the discussion. That's where the intellectual curiosity goes. So thank you, everyone.